I want to talk a little bit about what makes a good real estate market. What makes a market like worthy of investing? What do you look for? So I went to law school and had a friend, good friend, smart guy, wasn't in real estate, but back about 10 years ago was like insistent that he really wanted to get into real estate development. He had done a little bit of it. And he basically took a map of the United States and he started to look at these things like job growth and low taxes and school systems. And it kind of settled on Panama, Florida, of like, this is where it's all going to happen. This is going to be great. And he didn't really know much about it, and put a lot of money into it. And bottom line is he's a great guy, smart guy, but it was a big failure. I think the lesson in that story for me was, at its core, there's a lot of local knowledge that goes into real estate. So before I talk about these factors that make great cities, it's really important to like step back from that and say, okay, just because something's a great city, and I read yesterday that Fairbanks, Alaska has the best chance of real estate appreciating over the next 5 years, doesn't mean it's advisable to go to Fairbanks, Alaska and start a development company, right? Number one, these things shift and change all the time. Number two, it's really important that you know and feel and believe in what you're doing. And I think that's, in some ways, it can be an underrated part of real estate. Why? Real estate is non-fungible at its core. Money's fungible. Stocks are fungible in the sense that one share of stock is worth exactly the same as another share of stock. Even hotel rooms, in a sense, to some degree have fungibility. A hotel is not fungible. In other words, I can't put you in the Marriott and you expect it to stay in the Four Seasons and you're just going to be like, oh, it's just a room, okay? But within a hotel even, you could say, oh, I want a king courtyard view, and there might be 100 of those, right? So there's a fungibility aspect to it. There's a fungibility aspect to something like Rite Aid leases, right? If I own 10 Rite Aids in 10 different states, that's just cash flow. There's not really a non-fungibility aspect to that. In other words, if you're buying 10 Rite Aids, you're not doing it because you love the sunlight on the Rite Aids, patio, or you're just buying cash flow, okay, and credit at that point in time. With my market, when I operate more in residential, whether it's apartments, condominiums, even hotels at large, right? They are non-fungible, and so what side of the block you're on, is there a lot of traffic, have you seen things fail in this part of town before, are really important factors. And so in general, it's not enough to just say, oh, Austin's a great market, let me invest in Austin. Yes, macro, that may be true, but there's great sites in Austin and there's crap sites in Austin. There's great sites in New York City and there's crap sites in New York City. And so it's really important to start out in real estate for the most part and make yourself a subject matter, a location expert in a sense, because no matter what, for the most part with real estate, location is a big part of the equation. It's not the only part of the equation, there's many others, but you do need to really understand that location. Job growth. Cultural amenities, I'll call them, walkability, let's say, to restaurants or theaters or gyms or things like that. Schools for some people, safety, business-friendly environment, weather can even factor into that. And I would lastly put look for a narrative as well. It doesn't always have to have a narrative, but I think certain cities, they just develop these narratives. Like when I mention LA, I mention Nashville, I mention Austin, right? It conjures up something in your mind, specific, I would say. And so those things are all important. It's why we've seen a lot of motion from really the Rust Belt, let's call it Rust Belt / Northeast. We've seen outflows to the Southeast and the Southwest, let's call it Sun Belt, for a variety of those reasons. I don't think it's because the Sun Belt has a better culture. It's not straight out on culture. I'm not saying there's not culture there, but New York City, LA, those are culture capitals. But you look at things like business-friendly environment, cost of living, schools, safety at times, things like that. They start to attract people when a bunch of these things come together. And the second part of that is places like New York lives in a special place of its own, but with those, what I'll call the Rust Belt cities, if you look at Milwaukee, Chicago, Cleveland, those kind of cities, Detroit, right? A lot of problems, bad weather, high cost, high crime, business unfriendly, hard to start a business there. So, what do you get? You get outflows, not a lot of economic development, bit of stagnation, and those markets have not performed well over the last 10 years. All the motion really has, or I shouldn't say all the motion, but a lot of the motion has been in the Sun Belt states. Some of it's been coastal, like East Coast, West Coast, Sun Belt, right? And Midwest and up has not performed well. Why do I even do that history lesson? Because at some point in time, Chicago, for instance, and the Midwestern and some of those Rust Belt cities may get so undervalued relative to what other parts of the country are that they may become attractive again. I can make an argument that Chicago, although it does have a lot of problems, and I don't have any investment there, my sister lives there, but and I've been there a bunch, but other than that, I think it's almost gotten to a place where there's almost nowhere to go but up. I mean, there's still somewhere to go but up, but I feel like there's a lot of value there. And so I say that because markets can be great, but they can get overheated. And that's something we have to keep in mind as well. It's not just, Raleigh, Durham is a great market, let me invest there at any cost, or, I'm worried about New York City's problems. It's a relative value game. And so when you know that market well and you understand the blocks, the people, the demand, it just is a huge advantage to real estate development, real estate investment. You also get to know community players, you get to know regulators, you get to know the banks, you get to know the community groups. So all these things come into play. When you're going into a new geography, you never know what you're going to get. For sure, when you're developing, it's harder than when you're buying an asset. But even when you're buying an asset, you don't know what you're going to get. There can be surprises with taxes, with energy costs, with, just things you didn't expect. So with cities, you have to be focused on macro, which we just talked about, and then micro, right? And when we're talking micro, walkability, I think, is a big theme. Connection. Culture doesn't have to be high culture. We're not talking about the ballet. We're not talking about the opera. We're talking about cafes. We're talking about gyms, parks, just stores, any node that allows or encourages the public to kind of interact with it and with each other. And I think that a big trend, I would say, in real estate, and what I think is interesting and different from 20, 30 years ago, when, let's say, the baby boom was having its moment of moving into houses and having kids, and now the millennial is kind of the echo of that, right? What's happened that's been dramatic in that time, more than anything else, is the rise of the internet and social media. And so what we talk about today is very different than how we looked at the world coming out of the post-war era. Why? In the 50s and the 60s, cities were very crowded. People are like, just get me out of here, right? Highways had been invented, cars were pretty good, there wasn't a ton of traffic. And so this idea of just give me a home on some cul-de-sac, doesn't matter. This is where I want to raise my family, it goes deep, American dream, have my own plot of land. What I think has changed in the last 20, 30 years with social media, the metaverse, what I'll call the Apple, I think the metaverse is here. People talk about like the metaverse is this thing, like when you're on your phone or your screen for 4 hours a day, you're in the metaverse, okay? You're not next to somebody. And there's been a lot of evidence lately that loneliness and depression, lack of connection, and all these things have started to come into play. And so now we're looking at a generation of people that have grown up on screens, but they've also grown up in the hubbub of the Brooklyns and the San Franciscos and the Bostons and the city centers. And so the prospect of, say, moving outside of the city, I think looks a little bit different in terms of, we were talking about cultural nodes, but I feel like there's an opportunity, and I think a lot of strength will be where there's walkability, where there's little cafes and restaurants, not just like vacant farmland where you kind of put your plot down and you come home and you get into your screens or into your world. And I think that can be appealing in some ways, but the evidence is starting to show that it's bad for you, it's bad for your children, it's bad for mental health, right? We're all talking about these mental health struggles. People, Mark Zuckerberg testifies in front of Congress, right, apologizing for suicides, that were, supposedly related to social media. So I think there's a big trend around connectivity. Even in the business I'm in, where people talked about amenities a lot before, because we were going from like basic apartment buildings to I have a pool, or I have a gym, or I have whatever. I think social amenities is really like what the next piece of this is, and not like fake social amenities, like we're going to try to do some shitty wine and cheese cocktail party in some weird space, but having frictionless, easy, flowing kind of places where it interacts, where it causes people to interact with each other in a natural way. So I feel like experience, good planning on real estate is something that is trending, will trend. I think the millennials will demand that and demand more from their communities. Will it be enough to get America off its addiction to cars and highways, and remains to be seen. It's going to be a challenge in some of these, say, Southwest cities. But I was reading an article on drive-thrus the other day, and it was just like pretty wild, like how incredibly like detrimental drive-thrus are to like just humans. Basically, like if you're not in a car like talking to a screen, like you can't interact with them. Like they put retaining walls around the whole drive-thru. It just like sits in the middle of a street. It's like it just ruins connectivity. And I get it. There's convenience involved with that, and it's interesting because we've seen this battle before, right? We've seen it with Walmart knocking out really like a ton of downtown stores and small-time entrepreneurs. We've seen it with Walmart knocking out downtown stores, which really represent like local entrepreneurs. We've seen it, with banks and drive-thrus, and it's really like hurting the fabric. And I think and I hope that there's this movement back towards like real connectivity, a little bit of community, what I'll call new urbanism, where that aspect of sidewalks and interacting with people in a natural way starts to rank higher, because the evidence on the other side of the equation is pretty fucked up. It's an interesting battle, right? Because we all want convenience, and I know it's like, I just want to drive in there. I mean, I'm not in a car culture, but I just want to drive in there and get my thing. I don't want to interact with anybody. But at what price, ultimately? Was Walmart a great thing for this country or a terrible thing for this country? You could go either way on that. I'm not going to say I have an opinion. I have respect for the guy that built it, but it crushed a lot of downtowns. It eviscerated a ton of small entrepreneurs, and it basically pushed down the cost of goods. Created fast fashion and fast goods, and in effect, like kind of like junk that was made overseas, accelerated the trend of manufacturing away from the United States and into cheap labor countries, right? Walmart's got 50% of their people on food stamps, I think. So like the federal government basically subsidizes their whole workforce so that we can get like cheap TVs and garden tools. Like it's a weird circle, so I'm not here to pick on Walmart, but I do think there's opportunities to plan better as we're expanding into these cities in the future. Get better planning, new urbanism, get rid of drive-thrus, get rid of a million bank buildings and downtowns, and I could go on that for a long time. I think the retail scape is fucked up by these big credit chain tenants that make it very difficult for an owner to walk away from. Because here's like a fact. One thing about that retail scape, and also about starting businesses, is if you're trying to start a business and you're competing with the Gap or Zara or a bank or a CVS, you're going to always lose that battle in the prime location, because the owner is going to basically take the better credit. So, what's the solution to that? Well, it's hard. It's a little bit tricky, but I think it's something that, number one, if you're starting a business, you got to think about, because your credit's worse, and so it's going to put you at a competitive disadvantage, because someone's going to try to push that rent to what CVS could pay there, right? But is that always what's great for community, for society? Not necessarily. think when I look for what I'll call like cultural nodes, I would say food and beverage is a piece of that. I definitely look for local establishments, not chain restaurants so much, but are there local stores effectively? Because if there's local stores, like there's like a little bit of a pride and a connectivity with the community, I guess, is what I assume. So that's one of the things I look for. I love when I see like little local cafes or little local fashion stores or gyms and fitness places, coffee houses, things that are not necessarily chains. Like a few chains in there is not a bad sign either, but if it's all chains and it's kind of like this manufactured like strip of just a bunch of big names, that's not as interesting to me in general. I don't think it responds as well for what I do and for community. In terms of things that I look at that maybe have changed a little bit in the last 10 years, I think that close connection to a mass transit stop has probably become less important to me over the last few years. I don't think it's not important, but I think with the rise of Uber and those kind of car services and some of the stuff that's starting to come down the pipe with driverless cars, okay, maybe that's still a little bit of a ways away, depending, but I just think the aspect of being right on a train is a little bit less important than it was. I think that's also influenced by the fact that people are, going into work 3.5 or 4 days a week at times, right? Even if you're a 5-day worker, you're often a 4-day in the office and a 1-day from home. So I think certain pieces of that have made it that you can be a little bit further from that mass transit node. That's probably also combined with the fact that I don't want to say cities have gotten more dangerous. I don't think that's necessarily the truth, but I do think there's more narrative around subways and subway stations and some crazy stuff that sometimes happens there. So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to be 5 blocks away from, a subway or a PATH station instead of 1 block per se.